Good morning, everyone. Lots of discussion and conversations, which is always great to see. So welcome, everyone. Before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Aurora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present and emerging. And welcome everyone in the room, and welcome to those that have joined us online. So today's session is called Mapping the Digital Inequality and Media Use in Remote Communities, First Nations Communities. So the session that we're going to be talking about today is about the digital disadvantage faced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Despite historically very poor communications and information infrastructure and well-known risks of discrimination and exclusion entailed in algorithmic systems, remote communities can benefit substantially from improved media and communication services and appropriate modes of information and service delivery. So today we're going to hear from 4 speakers. Our first speaker is, from your right to left, is Dr. Dot West, First Nations Digital Inclusion Advisory Group member and Chair of Galari Media. So Dot has spent many years working in the media sector and is also an expert on the First Nations Digital Inclusion Advisory Group, which has been recently formed by the Federal Minister. And so Dot is the chair. So welcome, Dot, and thank you very much for taking the time to come and speak to us today. Second is Dr. Daniel Featherstone, who will provide an overview of the findings from the first year of Mapping the Digital Gap research project, a longitudinal study of digital inclusion and exclusion, media use and service delivery in remote First Nations communities. This project, being undertaken by ADM+S and the Australian Digital Inclusion Index team with funding partner Telstra, is helping to track progress on Target 17. Target 17 is the new Closing the Gap target, which hopes to close the digital divide between First Nations people and the rest of the country. We'll also hear from Lauren Ganley, next to Daniel. So Lauren is the Chief First Nations Advocate and Industry Partner with Telstra, and she'll be talking about why Telstra is supporting the Australian Digital Inclusion Index and the Mapping the Digital Gap project, as well as other digital inclusion initiatives. Lauren will speak to how this research helps to inform government policy and industry responses. She'll also be highlighting several of the Telstra Indigenous initiatives to address closing the gap as well. And last but not least, we have Dr. Jessup Rogers, who will provide an overview of the findings of the QUT research project Connecting in the Gulf, which explored the impact of digital inclusion challenges for low-income Aboriginal families living on Mornington Island, a remote community in the Gulf of Carpentaria in Queensland. So today the panel will discuss, after the short presentations, the challenges of online and automated service provision and access in remote communities with high levels of digital inequality. We'll also be looking forward to some of the questions from the audience on Slido. So as we're going along, feel free to pose your questions. We'll have all 4 presenters first, and then we'll have a panel discussion. So we hope to have some real good engagement from the audience. We also have roving mics, so if someone feels the need to actually have a verbal conversation, please jump up and down and let us know. But first and foremost, we'll put it through Slido. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dot West. Thank you.
Okay. Certainly the First Nations Digital Inclusion Advisory Group welcomes the opportunity to speak here today. The advisory group was established by the Australian Government earlier this year. I hate technology. Wait there. Here we go. All members are First Nations Australians, and we are supported by Digital Inclusion Expert Panel. Our purpose is to provide advice to the Federal Government on Target 17 of the National Agreement on Closing the Gap, which aims for equal levels of digital inclusion by 2025. 2026. Not far off. As you might be aware, this is a pretty ambitious target. We know that there is a significant digital divide for First Nations Australians. Remote First Nations communities are among the most economically and digitally disadvantaged in Australia. Yet there are also sites of extraordinary innovation, cultural and social resilience, and technical adaptation. The digital divide is impacting upon the social, economic and civic opportunities available to First Nations peoples. We need to reframe our thinking on digital inclusion by recognising that this is a human rights issue. It is an essential service. Affordable and reliable connectivity and the skills to be online effectively and safely is an enabler of access to benefits such as telehealth, online learning, employment, government services, social connectedness, and the list can go on. Just imagine yourselves without being digitally connected and what you'd lose out on. So in terms of the advisory group, sitting amongst you and presenting today are a few of the members of the advisory group and digital inclusion expert panel. Of course, the host, our wonderful Linda Norman Parker, is the advisory group's deputy chair. I keep trying to make him my co-chair, but he won't have it. He's an expert in digital inclusion, on-country learning and cultural heritage. Professor Bronwyn Carlson is an expert in First Nations social media use and online safety. Ms. Talia Elu is from the Torres Strait and is a member of the Queensland Government First Nations Consultative Committee. She is currently studying at ANU in Canberra. Ms. Naomi Moran is the co-chair of the First Nations Media Australia and General Manager of Koori Mail newspaper. Certainly supporting our work is a panel of experts from the telecommunications, media and broadcasting sectors, including Mr. Shay Cockatoo Collins, the Executive Manager of Indigenous Affairs at NBN Co. Ms. Lauren Ganley, the Head of Telstra's First Nations Strategy and Engagement Team, Dr. Scott Winch, the Director of Data Sovereignty for the New South Wales Coalition of Aboriginal Peaks, Dr. Daniel Featherstone, a Senior Research Fellow at REMIT, who leads the Mapping the Digital Gap project, Professor Ellie Rennie, a Principal Research Fellow at REMIT's Digital Ethnography Research Centre, Ms. Gillian Mailman, the Managing Director of Fibre Optics NQ, and Mr. Neil Turner, the Manager of the Pilbara and Kimberley Aboriginal Media Association, which supports remote communities in broadcasting and media across the Pilbara and Kimberley. Since its establishment, only back in January, the advisory group has been keen to hear from communities and stakeholders about their views on the barriers to digital inclusion and how they can be addressed. This includes hearing from land councils, peak bodies, community organisations, First Nations broadcasters and telecommunication providers. Our next phase of work will continue this engagement, particularly at the community level, wherever possible. In the short term, our key focus is providing an initial report to Minister Rowland, and this report will be delivered to her by the end of July this year. The report will include a number of recommendations relating to three key issues: delivery of targeted measures to improve access to connectivity, making sure it is affordable and fit for purpose, and that the First Nations people are aware of their connectivity options and have digital skills to be online safely. Improving the national collection and use of data so that we can better access the impact of measures delivered in community, as well as broader progress towards Target 17. Ensuring genuine engagement and collaboration with First Nations people and communities and supporting their access to government programs and opportunities. Although there will appear to be a focus on regional, rural and remote areas, our advice and proposals will also provide benefits to First Nations communities in urban and peri-urban areas. The advisory group has a strong preference for place-based solutions. We certainly don't purport to represent all First Nations people. We cannot. But what we have heard is that the best outcomes occur when communities are allowed a genuine voice in the decision and design-making process. So our solution is making sure that place-based solutions, community-led. So digital inclusion is a key enabler of a range of benefits, and with all the access that people within urban areas currently enjoy. Investments in digital inclusion need to be based on the needs of First Nations communities rather than the commercial interest of telecommunication carriers. Affordability is also critical, particularly in terms of the relative cost of data on prepaid plans. A lot of community people in remote communities operate on prepaid plans, and so there's a problem with the cost of data there. We need to explore the potential role different technologies such as LeoSat can play to support digital inclusion. There needs to be better coordination across government and industry on measures to address digital inclusion. We also need better data so we can understand what digital inclusion looks like in different settings and track progress towards Target 17. So the advisory group would be keen to hear from you if you're interested, and if you wish to contact us, please send an email to the advisory group secretariat. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Dot. And I just want to start before talking about mapping the digital gap project and just let you know that Dot West played an incredible role in actually getting that closing the gap target into place, into being. The government really did not want to know about having a target. They didn't want any additional closing the gap targets full stop, but they did not want one about digital inclusion because they had no way of measuring it. And so they really pushed back, and Dot was on the Coalition of Peaks when she was chair for First Nations Media Australia, and pushed and said, no, we have to have this, not only to have a target for digital inclusion, but also to ensure that First Nation media services are available to people in communities all across the country. So I just want to congratulate Dot on getting that target in place. So yes, I'm Daniel Featherstone. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at RMIT and have been working with a fantastic team on the Mapping the Digital Gap project. I'll just first acknowledge the work that distinguished Professor Julian Thomas did in pushing to get funding to get that data collection happening. We did not have a way of being able to collect data in remote communities through the Australian Digital Inclusion Index previously, and it needed a dedicated project to be able to go out and do face-to-face surveys, and fortunately Telstra came to the party and agreed to fund a 4-year project, which is the Mapping the Digital Gap project. So I'm very privileged to have had the opportunity to come and work on this project and to have a great team. So we've got Lyndon Almond Parker, Indigo Holcomb James, Jenny Kennedy, and Julian, of course, on the team, and Leah Hawkins, who's running around taking photos on the team. So we've just had a fantastic team to work with and be able to get out to 10 communities over last year and 11 communities this year to start doing that face-to-face data collection, both doing the survey, an expanded version of the ADII. I'll go to the next slide and tell you what it's about, as well as being able to do interviews with people in community to get a real whole of community picture of what digital inclusion looks like, what the challenges are for accessing services, and what the implications are of not having services for people in communities. So we partner with local organisations in each of the 10 communities that we visited over last year and 11 this year. We work with community co-researchers on the ground to do those surveys to make sure that we're getting the engagement, the trust with the community, and really to ensure that the project meets the needs of the local community as well. We have compiled all of the data we've collected for each community into a community outcomes report to give back to each community, along with some strategies that they may want to look at for a local digital inclusion plan, so they can really look at how they can build capacity from the ground up as place-based solutions. And so we want to be able to use those examples of these 10 case studies. We know there's 1,500 communities and homelands around the country. We can't be in all of those, but at least we can use these case studies as ways of demonstrating to other communities what they could be doing locally as well. So in the first year we went to 10 communities. We worked with 21 community co-researchers, undertook 530 surveys, 495 of those with First Nations people, and conducted 140 interviews. So there's been quite a lot of processing to sort of collate all of that information and give it back to communities. So if you want to go and see the more detailed reports, they're on the Mapping the Digital Gap page on the ADM+S website, and I'll show you the dedicated website we're in the process of setting up. What I'm not going to do today is give you the number, the scale of the digital gap, because you have to wait till next Tuesday to get that. So we have now a dashboard, a First Nations dashboard on the ADII webpage and dashboard, and you'll be able to see for the first time the scale of the digital gap by remoteness. So for people in capital cities, regional, remote, very remote, you'll now be able to see the scale of that. You'll be able to drill down according to access, affordability, digital ability, and be able to start to see some really granular information, as well as see the results for each of the 10 communities that we visited, and drill down on those as well. So it's going to be a fantastic resource, and we'll build over time. We're hoping to be able to expand that to more regional and urban. So today I'm going to give you just a brief summary of what we have seen as sort of common themes and some of the survey numbers that we are able to give you now. So as Dot said, prepaid mobile is the primary means of phone and internet access in communities. 86% of the people that we surveyed have their own, or they share a mobile phone. Even people where there isn't mobile coverage are using a mobile as their primary device over a Wi-Fi service, or when they travel in and out from towns. There's very low uptake of fixed line phone or internet services. So even though NBN will tell you that it's available all across the country, in fact people are very low to take up on postpaid services because they're on low income, unreliable incomes. The ability to pay those monthly bills is quite challenging, so people tend to go for the prepaid services. What we have seen that, you know, while there's 1,500 communities and there's been some fantastic programs like the Mobile Black Spots program, the Regional Connectivity program, there's about 750 to 800 communities. We're still trying to get exact numbers on this that now have mobile coverage, but about 700 smaller communities and homelands, so those communities of sort of less than 150 or 100 people tend often not to have mobile coverage and need different types of solutions. So the LEOs coming on board now that we've been hearing about are providing the ability to have more small cell mobile. There's Wi-Fi services. Some communities they want the services to be able to be switched off at night so that kids aren't staying up on the network at night time. So there's a whole range of new types of solutions that these smaller communities need. There's definitely an uptake of public Wi-Fi in communities. That's played a big role in addressing some of the access issues, and people are using Wi-Fi calling where they don't have mobile coverage or where they don't have credit. There's limited access to computers, printers and IT support in communities. As Dot was pointing out, affordability is one of the biggest issues that we've faced. It doesn't come out well on the Digital Inclusion Index measures because of the way that is worked out, which is to look at an internet bundle as compared with household income. So in communities where there's large shared households, that affordability isn't as, doesn't come out as clearly. But we do know from the surveys, households are paying about $167 on average. Some households paying hundreds of dollars for those prepaid services. What we do know is that 42% of people cited cost as a reason for not using the internet more. Costs of devices is a big issue because people often are replacing phones or handing them on to family members. People can go through multiple numbers within a year, so that becomes an issue as well. And that transition to online government services, as more and more through digital transformation, more of these services are online, less of those services are available within communities. People are having to pay to use their own devices to access services now. Digital ability is also a significant issue in many communities. Obviously, it's associated with English literacy often. It's also associated with the level of support that's available at a community level. So we've seen that, and where there's access to local devices and so forth. Particularly the elderly, there's very low take-up of using online services, for instance. People with low English literacy, many of the communities we're working in, people speak their own language as their primary language. People with disabilities and people who don't have access to services. So when we go into homelands with no mobile access, obviously digital literacy is very closely related. Cyber safety and scams are a significant concern. I'm not going to go into all the details of that, but if you look at some of our reports, you'll see the range of issues that are coming up, but scams particularly have been escalating. People are paying thousands of dollars to scams, and a lot of this is associated with that digital literacy and limited public awareness that's going on within communities. So there's definitely a need for programs for that. And so communities are very much asking to have more training and support and have local digital mentors. They don't want fly-in, fly-out programs. They want embedded programs through local organisations, local people trained up to provide that support. I wanted to include news and media use because it is a part of the Closing the Gap target as well. So having access to First Nations media is critical to accessing reliable and trusted information. But also what we've seen is that at least 50% and up to 90%, one of the communities, 100% of households did not have TV services working. So that's very significant in the sense that people aren't getting reliable information. They're relying primarily on social media for their news and information. And so there's a huge amount of misinformation, and we saw that during COVID, and heard some of that from our wonderful Welcome to Country yesterday with Michael West, hearing some of the incredible stories of what people are hearing through their social media and how that impacted during COVID. So not having TV working is also meaning that people are using their devices for accessing entertainment, and so that's putting a huge amount of congestion on the mobile network. It also means that people are paying at prepaid data rates for accessing services that the rest of us get for free. So there's a number of flow-ons. The congestion on those networks means that the kids are staying up late at night to do their entertainment and gaming and not going to school because they've been up all night. So there's all of these sort of flow-ons that are unintended consequences of a program that was never properly set up. First Nations radio and TV are primary services. They provide the locally relevant content and the information, but it's not always available to people in communities. There's very low use of radio. In fact, it's primarily in the car. And social media is a primary communications tool and a means of news. So we do need to ensure that there's checks and balances in the social media space for that reason. And news and emergency information, in asking people how they access those, it's primarily face-to-face. That's how people are getting their information, and using those local channels, those local Facebook programs and their own radio channels where they're available. I'm going to leave it there. The numbers will all be in the dashboard next week, and we will be putting out a dedicated report for the program from our first year of findings in just over a month's time, probably early September. We'll launch that. You can see the individual reports as well on our website. So thank you very much.
Morning everyone. So I'm Lauren Ganley. Apart from heading up Telstra's First Nations strategy, I'm also fighting the good fight as the First Nations advocate inside the company to make sure that we do what we can and do it well. Before I start talking about Telstra's programs, I do want to give a big shout out to Dot and to Daniel for getting closing the gap target 17 over the line. As Daniel said, it was a challenge, and anyway, we got there, thank God. And and Dot talks about closing the gap target 17 as being the one that underpins it all. You've got to have good connectivity to for all the other closing the gap targets to be able to follow. So Telstra's been funding ADII from the beginning, is that right, Julian? 2015. But then, as Daniel has said, of course, it lacked remote data, which is really important, and so through I think the hard work of Julian, they got Telstra over the line. And for all the researchers in the room, corporates need data in order for them to understand that this is important to fulfil a business case. So so that got over the line, thank goodness. It's a 4-year funding agreement, and just got approval to extend that. So yes, we'll carry on beyond 2024. Thank you. Next week on Tuesday, Vicky Brady, the CEO of Telstra, and Julian will present the ADII report. And as Daniel said, there'll be a snapshot of the mapping the gap data, but the full report will come in September, which is good. With all of the work that I do, I can't do it without a proper governance structure and leadership, and we do have a First Nations external advisory group that I tap into to get their views and opinions and to challenge, whatever I'm thinking and what we want to do at Telstra. So that's good. And then I do have a First Nations engagement committee within Telstra, and these people have been handpicked. They're people who are doers, can influence the company to get things done, because you can imagine in a big company like Telstra, it's I need all the advocates I can get across the company. And then, of course, it's been amazing being on the expert panel under Dot's leadership. She's a strong leader. She keeps us all in check. It's really great. It's one of the better panels I've been on, and we're only 6 months old, but we are getting things done. And what's wonderful is the Minister is absolutely passionate and committed to helping us get there by 2026. So I just wanted to give you a bit of an idea of some of the things that we're doing. So I've been at Telstra for a very, very long time. I did leave in the period of time where Telstra did get into trouble for improper selling, and I've returned to Telstra, been back for about 2 years, and we're really getting on and doing some good stuff. So digital inclusion programs. In Digimob, I actually led a piece of research back in 2013, and one of the big contributors to the report that I did came from Daniel, and you're at IRCA then, I think, yep. And what was great is it was such solid research that, I was lucky the Telstra Foundation funded me to fly all around the country talking to people, which was great. But it was the depth of that report that convinced Telstra to fund in Digimob. And so that's been going since 2016, and that's having it's had really good impact. The thing with all of our programs is they are First Nations led, so they are led by First Nations organisations, and it's the only way it can work. We, following that report, we partnered with the National Centre of Indigenous Excellence in Redfern to set up the Indigenous Digital Excellence Hub, and that produced some really great work. We've funded Deadly Digital Communities, working with the State Library of Queensland and Indigenous Knowledge Centres. We fund Mobile My Way, which is a digital literacy, we call it a telco literacy program, and so the Centre for Appropriate Technology deliver that in areas where we've put new mobile technology in remote communities. And through the Telstra Foundation, we fund Healthy Country AI, working with the North Australian Indigenous Land and Sea Management Alliance, who work with ranger groups right across the Northern Territory, and that's about using tech to care for country, and that's been a really wonderful program. We have set up a First Nations contact centre in Darwin. That was set up in 2021. It is, we've currently got, I think we've got 12 agents in the 12 agents in the centre. We're going to grow it to 30 agents. It's a 1-800 number. It's for First Nations people in Australia, but primarily sort of marketed and targeted to remote communities, and we're getting amazing feedback from our customers that we're talking to someone that is not rushing through a call and who understands the environment. And just a couple of weeks ago, we did a soft launch of a micro call centre on Palm Island, and that is all First Nations led. Telstra will fund all the training and fit out the centre, and so they'll look after our customers in remote and regional, and that'll have 10 full-time positions. And then in Jumbin in Queensland, we've just launched a little call centre there, and what we want to do with these 2 call centres is test and learn before we expand, because for many people that will know pre-COVID, all of our call centres were big and centred in the cities or overseas. But the learnings from COVID is that we need to be in the regions if we want them to provide value. Community check-in. So as a result of the mis-selling, we now are going out into community, talking to people about do you have any debt? Are you on the right plans? Helping people to just make sure that they're on the best plans as possible. Oh, what have I done there? I've done something to my slide, don't worry about it. The second point was on the previous one. But this here is, it's about going out into community and engaging, and it's working really well. The pink bus has become synonymous in communities. The slides on the right are in Warrabinda. That's where my father's from. That was, I was lucky to go there for the very first time last June. It was very emotional experience, but at the time I got to meet with the board, which was really wonderful. And then up the top that's Palm Island. They've all got beautiful outlooks, these communities, they're amazing. But we know that they are providing value to the communities. We know the importance of not turning up once, but going back so that people start to become familiar with us and feel comfortable out talking about their technology needs. I think that is all I have to say, so thank you.
Hi everyone, my name's Jessa Rogers and I am an ARC DECRA Fellow at the Digital Media Research Centre at QUT, and today I'll be talking to you about our project Connecting in the Gulf. Before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge country and pay my respects to elders past and present. So the Connecting in the Gulf project explored the impact of digital inclusion challenges on Mornington Island, which is a small Aboriginal community in the Gulf of Carpentaria in far north Queensland. And we took the idea for this project from the community. When I started working at the DMRC, I have lots of family members that live on Mornington Island, and I was discussing some of the work that we were doing at the DMRC around digital inclusion for low-income families on the ARC linkage project that was going on. And a couple of my family members said, well, what about Mornington Island? We can't access the internet on a regular basis, our phone lines go down all the time. Maybe you could come and have a look at what's going on up there. And so we had conversations about that, and I wasn't sure that the community would necessarily want that. So from there emerged our methodology, which was a little bit iterative, but started with Indigenous research principles and practices, which is where I come from at all times as a Wiradjuri researcher, but then was actually looking to see what the community wanted in terms of a method and methodology, because many people on Mornington Island speak Aboriginal languages as their first language, and I wasn't sure exactly how methods that I'd used in more urban environments might work in a remote community. So that was really where we started. And what that involved was a conversation with community members and elders around what it would look like for people such as myself and non-Indigenous researchers who were working with me on the project to come to Mornington Island and what was important around that. And what we heard was, we don't want to just see you once. We don't want you to fly in and out on the little plane. We want a chance to talk to you properly and not have, forms and surveys and things like that. We want time to actually have conversations. We want to do it in places that make us feel comfortable, including our houses, on our driveway, on our veranda, at local places in the community. And most importantly, we want to hear back what you heard, because we have researchers pop in all the time on planes. The planes are always full because there's somebody coming to see Mornington Island, but very rarely do we hear back exactly what you found. And so from that point on, we started to develop the methodology, and I went to Mornington Island for just under a week simply to talk about those conversations, the method, the methodology, who would like to be involved, what that might look like. And what we heard was it would be most appropriate for me. At that time I was travelling by myself. Very thankful to the Outer Foundation for funding us, and QUT had an Indigenous Ignite grant scheme. We did do this project on a shoestring budget, but we did manage to do it in an authentic and respectful way. That first visit was just these conversations. There was no data collection whatsoever. We discussed the project, and from there developed the ethics application and everything after that. We visited a second week. Myself and Amber Marshall, Dr. Amber Marshall came with me, and we started to collect data. We were informed by the community that an elder or somebody working at the council should be, for lack of a better word, a chaperone that would come and take us to the family's homes or the places that family would ask us to meet with them. They would ring around the community based on who had identified the project as of interest. And so, you know, participant A said, you know, I'd like to talk to the researchers. Could they come on this day? And then they'll call around, is now a good time? No, come back later after lunch. And we were just completely flexible. We had no timetable. Unfortunately, we didn't have a car that first visit. Mornington Island is Mornington Island is not small. The island is, you know, over 30 kilometres long, but Goonana, the town, is very small. So you can get around on foot. It was quite hot. I'm very unfit, so I struggled at that first visit. But it was good to see, you know, what life is like. And a lot of elders in that community do have mobility issues. There's one shop on the island. Sorry business, unfortunately, for Mornington Island is a regular occurrence, and that means things shut down, including that one and only shop that provides food. So, you know, and there's that one plane service, Rex, that flies into the airport. There is two routes, one that goes through Cairns, and then the other that comes from Mount Isa. And those planes service all of the school children on the island that are doing high school. There is no high school on Mornington Island. And that was, truthfully, one of my key interests, given my DECRA project is on Indigenous boarding school students and their outcomes. And my PhD was on the same topic, and I'm very interested in understanding how students who'd like to remain on country can actually access education in their communities if they don't have access to internet that works, you know, regularly, reliably and affordably. Anyhow, what happened was we ended up yarning, but also we had kind of broached the idea of doing technology tours, which had come from the ARC linkage project. And that idea was that family members or somebody might show you through a home and say, you know, this is my modem, or this is my mobile phone, this is my iPad. It became pretty clear very quickly that that was not going to work. Families were very clear with us, we don't really have anything to tour, but we can bring the devices out and show you. And so what emerged was this method we called show and yarn. So you can see a picture here of one person showing us their device. This device was the device that they use for everything. It was amazing to hear, and I had kind of expected based on my previous experiences, but it was just amazing to see the links between our project and other work that's been done in remote communities, all of those things around you know, handheld devices, prepaid mobile data being mostly the only source of internet connection that many families had, kids hotspotting and others hotspotting off one device in the home. Sometimes elders and older people did not actually understand the reason that their data was getting used faster than others, because they were connecting to mostly older devices like Xboxes and PlayStations, and then the next day the data would be gone. And there were conversations like, I think I got ripped off, my plan is not as good as so-and-so's, because when I went and put the $30 recharge on, mine only lasted 2 days, whereas so-and-so's lasted 2 weeks. So there were interesting conversations around that hotspotting, and I'll talk about the findings in a little bit. Those were the interviews, the yarns that we did with families, but separately to those family conversations and community member conversations, we also did interview community organisations and personnel. So Bino is the organisation that administers Centrelink on the island. It's outsourced through them. We went and spoke with them, health providers, social service providers, the council and others, and those were more I would say interview format, but there were no questions set, so it was still very much like a yarn. But we did have the chance to kind of understand from a different perspective, hear what the families had to tell us, and then understand from that community organisation perspective. So what we found was, as I mentioned, that dependency on prepaid mobile, almost entirely for families. I think we did find that some of the families that had solid employment and ongoing employment were accessing mobile plans rather than prepaid. So some of the more digitally literate people had gone into CANS and gotten onto a plan with Telstra. Telstra is the only provider on the island. Data sharing was completely prevalent throughout the community, and generally there was one person in the household that was buying the recharge, and then everybody else was hotspotting off that device. You can see down the bottom, a community Wi-Fi had been installed, the little satellite dish. We're still kind of, I guess, sifting through these findings, but what we heard was this Wi-Fi, which was running pretty much all daylight hours, was for youth only. And when we discussed, you know, you can go down there, you can connect, it's free, everything like that, the older people were still like, no, we don't want to use it. You can see it's a pretty open space. What you can't see is down the end of that long building is actually the corrections office, so there's that. It's also next door to the store, which is the only shop on the island, and there's a lot of orders that mean people can't be in the same area as others, and you're almost entirely going to see somebody if you sit under this building, because everybody's going to the store at all hours, driving past and things like that. It's also very hot, and was hot when we were there. There is shade, as you can see, but it's still hot underneath. So we were surprised at the low uptake of the Wi-Fi, the free Wi-Fi. We drove past when we had the second visit every single day that we were there, and at no time did we see more than 2 people. And we weren't sure that they were actually using it because they were sort of just sitting under there. We couldn't actually see if they were using devices. Importantly, and this was something that I'd like to talk about a little bit more when we come to questions, the coverage on the island for the Telstra mobile phone coverage only covered Goonana, the township, and the township is such a small part of the island. What you've got is the township where everything in terms of services and homes happens, and the airport, and you know, all of the things that would happen in the community. And then you've got the rest of the island, which is outstations and homelands where different families have varying types of structures, some more like houses, others, you know, a roof and a floor, others looking different to that, but very much their place on country, and that is their place where they go for cultural practices and things like that. As soon as you drive out of the town, your mobile phone reception goes, and then you're left on your own. And there is no way to contact emergency services. We heard many, many stories of elders simply being too scared to leave Goonana. They didn't want to go out on country because they were scared. People had died. People had had to go back on foot to call for help. We heard stories of, pretty shocking things that you couldn't really imagine would be happening in Australia. Even within the township of Goonana, in the very, very recent memory of the town, there'd been almost a week where all telecommunications had gone down. They could not use FPOS, they could not use the one ATM that they had access to, the shop, as I mentioned, the only place you can buy food. Luckily there's a butcher next door, and they somehow had access to cash, so they were giving $100 bills out to community members on a trust basis so that people could afford to get food. It's just hard to understand how that could still be happening. And they were very angry. Community members were angry and saying, you know, we had no way of contacting anybody. You know, we were running to the hospital when things were going wrong. Why did they leave us for so long? We don't understand what happened. And I guess amongst the community, they'd been talking, and they believed it was because kids in Doomadgee had been throwing rocks at the tower. And that was very much what people thought had happened. So there were lots of stories about this kind of feeling left alone and wanting to be connected. Finally, the social media use. It was hard because the young people in the town were in a period of, I guess, feeling a little bit unsettled. There were some young people had stolen the car from the school and gone joyriding. The mayor was chasing them. We ended up volunteering at one of the social services to make sandwiches and cut up food because we were trying to get the youth basically off the streets and go to the PCYC so that some of that unrest could die down. And you know, these are not uncommon issues in these communities, but what the elders were saying is they're organising this like antisocial behaviour via Facebook Messenger. And, you know, there were some really, I guess, quotes that stuck out in my mind in those yarns. You know, you see them running down the street, their faces lit up by the screens of the phones. But then on the other side, there were a lot of conversations with the same elders saying we want more coverage, not just because it's safer for us to go out of town when we can call for help. Young people don't necessarily want to come out on the homelands because they can't go on Facebook and they can't use their phones and they're bored. And so if we could extend the coverage across Mornington Island, land and waters, our cultural practices would have more chance of being passed through generations, as well as safety and all of those considerations. With the organisations, there are some organisations that are really successful, and I guess the most well-known would be MI Arts, which is you know, a world-famous now art centre. And, you know, obviously Centrelink still runs, you've got the police, you've got other organisations that use the internet. Most of them are connected via NBN satellite. They also were experiencing outages, and 54 Reasons, which used to be Save the Children, actually had, you know, computers set up so that people could come in and do digital literacy classes, but they didn't work because they were so, like, they're literally at the back of the room, but they couldn't get the internet to work. They just circle. And so there were computers sitting there, but they couldn't be used because the strength of the signal was just so low and there were so many dropouts. Yeah, MI Arts told us, you know, you have to restart the computer all the time. They had constant issues with just basic services. There is digital literacy classes happening through that Centrelink office or agent, but this was an interesting finding as well. Mornington Island, almost all of the Aboriginal families there are low income, but not all of those people are registered with Centrelink. And what you'd have is like a family, up to like 5 people, 6 people, sharing one person's income from Centrelink. The Centrelink perspective was that there was an aspect of shame around it. We never heard those stories from the community, but what we did hear was people didn't have birth certificates, couldn't access, you know, some of the forms that they needed, didn't have, you know, a licence and so forth, and so it was just all too hard. And to get access to those digital literacy classes through Centrelink, you had to have a Centrelink number. So many people were actually excluded from those classes. But we did see lots of employees developing digital skills, working at the council, working at the art centre and so forth, learning how to use emails. Most people were able to do those things if they were shown by their grandkids or younger people on their phones, but as soon as they moved to the desktop, they didn't know what to do. And so that was something that people kept saying, you know, if I had a laptop or I had a computer, I'd like to learn how to use that so that I'm able to do that in the future. I think that's pretty much it for now. I'll save my other comments till later. Thank you.
Thanks everyone. So we have 5 minutes for panel discussion. And I'll read backwards actually from, there's quite a few good questions. But will remote communities transition to commercial services like Musk's Starlink? Might this change the media mix, or is mobile and Facebook going to stay this sticky? Anonymous. So, Daniel, Dot, Lauren?
I can speak quickly to the Starlink. So our experience so far, and we know it's early days for Starlink and low Earth orbit services, but generally because Starlink is an upfront cost to purchase the equipment and then a monthly bill of $139, the only take up of Starlink is by the agencies within communities and by staff who, agency staff, people with a reliable income. So it hasn't had any community household take up that we're aware of yet in the sites we've visited, but it certainly is being described as a game changer by those people who have it, in that it's providing a very fast download. Like, we measured nearly 10 times the speed of Sky Muster services, and unlimited download, which is one of the concerns that communities, that households that have taken up Sky Muster have said, look, we've got a lot of people drawing on the service. We've used all of the data up within a month, within a week of the month, so they have to wait until it's refreshed. So that's really made a big difference. Also, a lot of the agencies are using cloud-based services and the low latency of the LEOs compared with SkyMuster means a lot of those services work better than they did on SkyMuster.
Thanks, Daniel. Did you want to add anything, Lauren?
Just that Telstra and Optus have announced recently that they're in partnerships with Starlink. So for Telstra, it'll be by the end of the year that it'll be available, and they'll have worked out some plans. But you know what the plans are, and then of course, you know, for probably everyone on this panel, we're worrying about affordability and is there going to be a prepaid offer? But for Aboriginal people in remote communities, mobile technology is the technology that works and is considered the best technology. So that's not going anywhere. We just have to get it better though.
Thanks. And maybe Dot would like to respond to the next question. Prepaid is key here. What interventions are being explored beyond consumer advice and education?
Say that again.
Prepaid mobiles is key here. What other interventions are being explored beyond prepaid?
Well, we're trying to make it so that it's more affordable, the prepaid service, but when telcos put their prices up, it's really difficult to do so. And I think it's really trying to look at other ways of people being able to get online, and whether that's the NBN mesh system of being able to get online, but really in a lot of communities there's you know, just that collective approach of having access, where it's the sharing of devices or where it's being able to be in a location where you can get connected.
Thanks, Dot. Another question, Daniel. Are there substantial differences in these statistics across communities when you were talking about the mapping of the digital gap? And can you tell us more about the standard deviation, or Tuesday question mark?
You'll have to wait for Tuesday for that answer, for that one. But yes, there are wide variations between communities depending on their remoteness, the types of connectivity they have. Some of these communities have good mobile services. Others that we've been to have no mobile at all, and are reliant on maybe the public phone and a couple of patches of Wi-Fi, and so. Obviously, access is the big issue, the big variation that we've seen in terms of the types of communities we've visited. We know that in very small homelands, access is obviously the primary issue. Once people have access, affordability is obviously the next level issue, and digital ability, where there's access, then people start to use the services. There's a lot more peer sharing and learning. But as we talked about, the digital ability varies widely within a community, depending on people's age and the way that they're using services. So people are using social media and some online services, but aren't necessarily transferring to using like Microsoft or workplace type services. So there's basic level generally.
Thanks, Daniel. And we have two questions around infrastructure. So Ellie says, can you tell us more about the challenges of place-based solutions when people don't always know what the infrastructure or retail options are and challenges are? The other question to that is ownership of tech infrastructure by remote communities considered in that strategy. So maybe it's one for Lauren and Jess.
A good thing that's come out of the First Nations Digital Inclusion Advisory Group is that there's been a push to get the telcos talking to each other, which is really great. And in fact, we had our first meeting just recently because, you know, the technology's got to be agnostic for people. They just want to be able to use their mobile, get on the internet. It doesn't matter who's delivering it as long as it's reliable. So anyway, I'm really looking forward to that, and for the first time in decades, we are talking to each other, which is a big step forward.
Yeah, for me, I guess what I wanted to end on was around digital sovereignty, and not to be confused, I guess, with data sovereignty, but digital sovereignty. One of the ways that we interpreted our data through an Indigenous lens was actually coming back to that idea of country, which is who we are as Indigenous people. Everything's country-based. And I think there's this idea that internet or technology or infrastructure is like landless, but actually it's based in country as well. And land-based infrastructure is actually impacting in some ways access to country, but also those relations that extend from land. So we're not talking about just the physical, but the spiritual, social, cultural context of life, which Indigenous people in these communities are interacting with. And digital access to those Indigenous knowledges and societies actually happens through that infrastructure. So when we talk about building, more towers or greater access in these communities, I think from an Indigenous perspective, and you've heard about some of the great groups that are being Indigenous-led. I'm lucky to be on the ACAN Indigenous Steering Committee with other Indigenous leaders, and it is so important to have Indigenous voices leading this growth of technology, because it is the community's choice, what they want for their community, how much access they want, the things that they need. And coming back to that land-based perspective is what digital sovereignty is about, not just who owns data and how it's shared, but actually that land-based, place-based perspective.
Thanks. And we're running over time. So one last question from David Noland. Given your findings, yesterday they talked about YouTube news basically being trash, quote, end of quote. Given your findings, is there scope necessity to engage with YouTube around news quality? Daniel.
Yes. Look, people do describe YouTube as their primary way of getting news and information, entertainment, music, pretty much everything. And so between, social media, TikTok, Facebook, YouTube, that's how people are getting a lot of their information. So I think that's critical that we're doing some work in that space to make sure that those services are both providing reliable information, that people have a way of understanding, how to interpret what is misinformation or, the inappropriate content that all comes through, so that there's agency within that space, and also creation of content to be able to share over these platforms. We've had the First Nations media sector going for over 40 years, primarily funded only through radio now, with NITV and ICTV as well, providing TV services. But we need to be much more supported to be for that content to be shared out through the platforms that people are now using.
Thanks, Daniel. And if you could pass the mic to Dot, and just Dot will finish by closing our session. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone for having a listen to what we have to say. But just to wrap it up, I suppose what's really important is that digital inclusion, is that communication, being able to have access to information is a human right, and we need to ensure, no matter how, that our First Nations communities don't get left behind. Because as we move further and further into this orbit of information and communication on digital devices, if we don't watch out, we're going to be leaving a lot of people behind, and we need to make sure that doesn't occur. We are asking the industry, the telcos, we're asking government, and we ask ourselves, and of course we ask you to support this initiative. It's 2026 is the challenge for government, to close that digital divide, to ensure that our people have access to communication channels so that they're informed to be able to make their own decisions, to empower themselves. And so we need to look at a really strong way in doing it. We're asking everyone to be able to coordinate their efforts. but also government need to look at their regulations, look at their policies, and the almighty dollar needs to come to the table, basically, to enable it to happen. But at the same time, we want the telcos, we want the industry to realise their corporate responsibility, to ensure that we continue to strengthen the oldest living culture in the world and be proud of it.